The glass that cut through steel. Imagine you're a Spanish conquistador in 1521. You've got steel armor that's protected European knights for centuries. You've survived battles from Italy to the Netherlands. You feel invincible. Then an Aztec warrior swings what looks like a wooden paddle at you, and it slices clean through your steel breastplate like butter. Not possible, right? Wood against steel. But it happened. Over and over. Spanish soldiers watched in horror as their armor that could deflect swords and arrows, got shredded by weapons made from volcanic glass. Obsidian. That's what we're talking about. A naturally occurring volcanic glass that the Aztecs turned into weapons so sharp, so devastating, that modern surgeons still use obsidian scalpels today because they're sharper than anything we can manufacture with steel. And here's the thing that kept me up for nights after I started researching this. We've completely misunderstood how these weapons worked, how they were made, and why they were so effective. The story you learned in school? Wrong. The documentaries you've watched? Missing the most important parts. Because this isn't just about sharp rocks. This is about a civilization that understood material science at a level that makes modern metallurgists scratch their heads. This is about weapons technology that we still can't fully replicate with all our modern tools. So buckle up, because I'm about to show you how volcanic glass brought steel-armored conquistadors to their knees, and why this story changes everything you thought you knew about ancient technology. Let me start with the moment that made me obsessed with this topic. I was reading this account by Bernal Diaz del Castillo. He was a conquistador who fought in the conquest of Mexico, and he wrote this incredibly detailed memoir years later. And there's this passage where he describes watching an Aztec warrior swing a Macuahuitl, that's the Aztec obsidian sword, at a horse. One swing, the horse's head came off, clean, in one hit. Now I read that, and my first thought was, no way. That's exaggeration. Soldiers always exaggerate in their war stories. But then I kept reading other Spanish accounts, different soldiers, different battles, different contexts, and they all say the same thing. These obsidian weapons were cutting through things they shouldn't be able to cut through. Spanish steel swords couldn't do that. European battle axes couldn't do that. So what the hell was in these Aztec weapons that made them so devastating? That question sent me down a rabbit hole that lasted 6 months and took me to some really unexpected places. Materials science labs, archaeological sites in Mexico, even conversations with modern surgeons who use obsidian scalpels. And what I found out is way stranger than I expected. So let's talk about obsidian itself, because understanding the material is the key to understanding why these weapons were so effective. Obsidian forms when volcanic lava cools so quickly that crystals don't have time to form. You get this amorphous glass structure, no crystal lattice, just frozen liquid rock, and that creates some wild properties. First off, sharpness. When you fracture obsidian, the edges can be literally 1 molecule thick. That's sharper than any steel blade ever made. A good steel surgical scalpel has an edge width of about 300-600 angstroms. Obsidian can go down to 30 angstroms. That's 10 to 20 times sharper. But here's what blew my mind when I learned it. Sharp doesn't automatically mean effective in combat. A razor blade is incredibly sharp, but it's not going to cut through steel armor. So there has to be more to the story. The Aztecs understood something about obsidian that took modern materials scientists centuries to figure out. They understood that different types of obsidian have different properties, different hardness levels, different fracture patterns, different colors that indicate different chemical compositions, and they were selecting specific types of obsidian for specific purposes. This wasn't random. This was sophisticated materials science. Let me tell you about the Macuahuitl in detail, because this weapon is the star of our story. The word basically means hand wood in Nahuatl. It's a wooden club, usually made from oak or another hardwood, about 3 to 4 feet long, shaped kind of like a cricket bat but flatter. And along both edges, they'd embed obsidian blades. Lots of them. Sometimes 8 or 10 blades per side. Now, the Spanish called these swords, but that's not quite right. It's more like a saw sword hybrid. The obsidian blades stuck out slightly from the wooden core, and they were sharp on both edges in most cases. But here's the engineering genius that nobody talks about. How do you attach glass blades to wood in a way that they don't just shatter on first impact? Because obsidian is glass, right? It's brittle. Hit it wrong and it breaks. So how did the Aztecs create a weapon that could take the stress of combat without the blades exploding into fragments? They used a combination of groove cutting and natural adhesives. The wooden core had precise grooves carved into it, and when I say precise, I mean the tolerances were insane for a pre-industrial society. The obsidian blades fit into these grooves with minimal wiggle room. Then they'd secure the blades with a combination of adhesives, tree resin primarily, but not just any resin. They'd mix it with other compounds to create something that was both flexible and incredibly strong. Some analysis of preserved Macuahuitls shows they used resins from the copal tree combined with pine pitch, heated and applied in specific ratios. The result was a bond that could flex slightly under impact, distributing force, preventing the blades from shattering. It's the same principle used in modern composite materials. The Aztecs figured this out empirically, through trial and error, without any of the theoretical frameworks we use today. And here's where it gets really interesting. The obsidian blades weren't just stuck on randomly. They were oriented at specific angles. The cutting edge would be set at a slight angle to the direction of swing, which created a slicing action rather than just a chopping action. Think about cutting a tomato. If you press straight down with a knife, even a sharp one, you're going to squash it before you cut it. But if you draw the knife through with a slicing motion, that's when you get a clean cut. The Aztecs built that slicing action into the weapon's geometry, so when a warrior swung a Macuahuitl, the obsidian blades weren't just hitting the target, they were slicing through it. And because obsidian is so sharp, it could slice through materials that would stop a steel blade. But wait, steel is harder than obsidian. Steel is around 5 to 6.5 on the Mohs hardness scale, depending on the alloy. Obsidian is around 5 to 5.5. So how could a softer material cut through a harder one? This is where I had to talk to a materials scientist to understand what was actually happening. Dr. Sarah Chen at MIT, she studies ancient materials and technologies, explained it to me like this. Hardness and cutting ability aren't the same thing. Hardness is about resistance to deformation. Cutting ability is about concentrating force on a small area and creating a shearing action. Because obsidian can be sharpened to a molecular edge, it concentrates force incredibly efficiently. When that edge hits steel armor, we're talking about pounds of force concentrated on a line that's literally molecules wide. The pressure per square inch is astronomical, and here's the thing about steel armor. It's designed to resist penetration from steel weapons with relatively blunt edges. Medieval swords weren't that sharp. They were designed to focus force on a point or edge that was still relatively wide. Armor was designed to deflect or resist that. But nobody in Europe had faced anything with an edge measured in molecules. Spanish armor simply wasn't designed to handle that kind of cutting pressure. It would slice through like the armor wasn't even there. Dr. Chen told me, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the obsidian Macuahuitl represents one of the most sophisticated applications of materials science in the pre-industrial world, because they were exploiting properties of obsidian that wouldn't be theoretically understood until the 20th century. That's insane. The Aztecs were using quantum-scale engineering without knowing about quantum mechanics. Now let me tell you about the different types of obsidian weapons, because the Macuahuitl wasn't the only one. They had obsidian-tipped spears and atlatl darts. That's the spear thrower system. The atlatl could launch a dart with enough force to penetrate Spanish armor at range. Multiple Spanish accounts mention being wounded by obsidian projectiles that went straight through their protection. They had obsidian knives, some small for everyday use, some larger for combat and ceremonial purposes. These knives could perform surgeries that Spanish surgeons couldn't match with their steel instruments. There are accounts of Aztec physicians performing procedures that Spanish doctors considered impossible. They even had obsidian razors used for shaving and grooming. Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, supposedly had his head shaved daily with obsidian razors. Spanish observers noted how incredibly close and smooth the shave was compared to European methods. But the Macuahuitl was the signature weapon. That was the one that won battles. That was the one that made Spanish soldiers have nightmares. Let me tell you about a specific battle that really illustrates what we're talking about. The Battle of Otumba in 1520. Though actually, that battle is famous for other reasons. But there were smaller engagements during the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan, where these obsidian weapons really showed their capabilities. Spanish soldiers were fleeing the city after what they called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, when the Aztecs drove them out with heavy losses. And during this retreat, Spanish soldiers were getting hit by Aztec warriors with Macuahuitls. One account describes a soldier whose steel sword was shattered, not just nicked or damaged, but broken in half when it struck a Macuahuitl. The obsidian blades caught the steel, and when the Aztec warrior twisted, the Spanish sword snapped. Another account describes a horse that was struck in the neck by a Macuahuitl, and the wound was so severe the animal couldn't continue. The Spanish were terrified because they relied heavily on horses for their advantage, and suddenly their mounts were vulnerable to Aztec weapons in ways they'd never experienced in European warfare. Now here's what's wild. The Spanish won the overall war. We know that. But it wasn't because their weapons were better. The Spanish won because of disease, because of indigenous allies who hated the Aztecs, because of political divisions in the Aztec Empire. In terms of pure weapons technology, the obsidian Macuahuitl was arguably superior to Spanish steel swords in many combat situations. And this is where modern archaeology and experimental archaeology get really interesting. There have been attempts to recreate authentic Macuahuitls using traditional methods, and it's hard. Like, really hard. Getting the obsidian blades to the right size and shape without power tools requires enormous skill. Ancient Aztec craftsmen would spend years learning the technique of knapping obsidian. That's the process of shaping it by carefully controlled fracturing. They'd use antler or hardwood tools to pressure flake the obsidian, removing tiny chips to create the blade shape. It's like sculpting with glass that can slice your hand open if you mess up. The skill level required is comparable to what we'd expect from a master craftsman in any field, and the knowledge of which obsidian to use for which purpose, that was specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Different volcanic sources produce different types of obsidian. Some are better for blades, some for cores, some for decorative purposes. The Aztecs had trade networks that brought obsidian from sources hundreds of miles away. They weren't just using whatever volcanic glass was nearby. They were selectively sourcing specific types for specific applications. That's sophisticated materials logistics. Let me blow your mind with something most people don't know. Obsidian sourcing can be traced geochemically. Every volcanic source has a unique chemical signature. By analyzing trace elements in obsidian artifacts, archaeologists can determine exactly which volcano the obsidian came from. And what they've found is that Aztec obsidian weapons often used material from sources 50, 100, even 200 miles away from where the weapons were found. That means organized mining operations, long-distance trade, quality control systems to ensure the right obsidian got to the right craftsman. This isn't primitive technology. This is industrial-scale resource management. The Aztecs had a supply chain for weapons manufacturing that would make sense to a modern military procurement officer. Now I want to talk about something uncomfortable. Why didn't obsidian weapons spread beyond Mesoamerica? Because if they were so effective, why didn't the technology spread to Europe or Asia or other parts of the world? Part of it is availability. Obsidian only forms in volcanic regions. If you don't have volcanoes, you don't have obsidian. Simple as that. Europe has some volcanic regions, but they're limited, and the obsidian there isn't always suitable for weapons. But the bigger issue is metallurgy. Once societies developed advanced metalworking, obsidian weapons became obsolete. Not because metal is sharper, it's not, but because metal is more durable. You can repair metal weapons. You can't repair an obsidian blade once it breaks. An obsidian Macuahuitl is devastating in battle, but after the battle you're probably replacing several blades. A steel sword might get nicked, but it's still functional. In a long campaign, the logistics favor metal weapons, even if they're not quite as sharp. The Aztecs never developed advanced metallurgy, not because they weren't smart enough, they clearly were, but because they didn't have the right ore deposits readily available, and by the time they might have developed it, they'd already optimized obsidian technology so effectively that there wasn't much pressure to switch. And this gets at something that frustrates me about how we talk about ancient technologies. There's this assumption that metal weapons are inherently superior to stone weapons, but that's not necessarily true. It depends on context, on what you're optimizing for, on what resources you have available. The Aztecs optimized for sharpness and cutting power. European armies optimized for durability and versatility. Neither approach is objectively better. They're different solutions to different problems. If you're fighting short, intense battles where maximum cutting power matters more than long-term durability, obsidian wins. If you're fighting extended campaigns where you need weapons that can be maintained in the field with limited resources, steel wins. But we've inherited this narrative where Stone Age means primitive and Iron Age means advanced, and that's just not accurate. The Aztecs were using stone technology that was in some ways more sophisticated than European metal technology. They just went down a different tech tree, to use a video game analogy. Let me tell you about modern obsidian scalpels because this is where the ancient technology connects to the present day. In the 1970s and 80s, some surgeons started experimenting with obsidian scalpels for very delicate procedures: eye surgery, neurosurgery, reconstructive surgery, places where you need the absolute sharpest possible blade to minimize tissue damage. And they found that obsidian scalpels created cleaner incisions than steel. The cuts healed faster with less scarring. Under an electron microscope, you could see that steel scalpels, even the best ones, create a slightly ragged cut edge. The tissue is torn at a microscopic level. Obsidian creates a genuinely clean cut. The cells are sliced apart rather than torn. This is 1970s surgeons discovering what Aztec physicians knew in 1500 AD. The ancient technology was actually superior for certain applications. Now, obsidian scalpels aren't used widely because they're more expensive and they're fragile. You can't drop them, can't autoclave them the same way as steel, can't reuse them as easily. For most surgeries, steel is more practical. But for the highest precision work, obsidian is still used occasionally even today. That blows my mind. A 500-year-old technology that's still competitive with modern manufacturing. Let me tell you about the ceremonial and cultural significance of obsidian, because it wasn't just about weapons. Obsidian was sacred to the Aztecs. It was associated with Tezcatlipoca, one of their most powerful gods. The name Tezcatlipoca literally means smoking mirror, and mirrors were made from polished obsidian. Aztec priests used obsidian mirrors for divination. They'd gaze into the polished black surface to receive visions and communicate with the gods. And these weren't crude mirrors. Some of the surviving examples are polished to an absolutely incredible degree. You can see your reflection as clearly as in a modern mirror. The level of craftsmanship required to create a perfectly polished obsidian mirror with Neolithic tools is absurd. You're working with a material that's harder than most stones, that can shatter if you apply too much pressure, and you need to achieve an optically perfect surface. It takes months of careful work, and they were doing this regularly. These weren't rare treasures. Many Aztec nobles owned obsidian mirrors. It was a sophisticated industry. So there's this weird dichotomy where obsidian was both everyday technology and sacred material. Warriors carried obsidian weapons, but obsidian was also the material of divine mirrors, of ceremonial knives, of objects that connected the human world to the divine. I think this tells us something important about how the Aztecs viewed technology and spirituality as interconnected rather than separate. The same material that could take someone out of this world, literally and figuratively, could also reveal divine truths. The sharpness that made obsidian effective in combat made it symbolically significant in ritual. Western thought tends to separate the practical from the spiritual, but Mesoamerican cultures didn't make that separation. Technology was spiritual. Ritual was practical. They were aspects of the same reality. Now let me tell you about what happened to obsidian technology after the Spanish conquest, because this is where things get sad. The Spanish banned Aztec weapons. Obviously, you don't conquer an empire and then let the conquered people keep their military technology. So Macuahuitls were confiscated and destroyed. The knowledge of how to make them was actively suppressed. Spanish priests saw obsidian's association with Aztec religion, and they destroyed obsidian mirrors, obsidian ceremonial objects. They burned codices that might have contained information about obsidian working techniques. Within a generation or two, the knowledge was mostly lost. Some continued in secret. There are indigenous communities in Mexico that still know how to knap obsidian for small tools and decorative objects. But the sophisticated weapons-making tradition? Largely gone. We've had to reverse engineer it based on surviving examples and archaeological evidence, and we still don't understand everything. Some of the adhesive formulas used in ancient Macuahuitls are still mysteries. We can analyze the chemical components, but we don't know the exact proportions or preparation methods. It's like finding a Roman concrete structure that's still standing 2,000 years later. We know it worked. We can analyze what's in it, but we can't quite replicate it with certainty because the process knowledge was lost. And this is a pattern you see throughout history. When one culture conquers another, technologies get lost. Not because they're inferior. The Spanish knew Aztec weapons were effective. That's why they banned them. But because the conquering culture suppresses the conquered culture's knowledge, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through neglect. How much knowledge have we lost this way? How many sophisticated technologies were developed by cultures that were conquered or collapsed, and the knowledge disappeared because nobody wrote it down, or the records were destroyed? The Macuahuitl is one example we happen to know about because the Spanish wrote descriptions of it, because they were so impressed and terrified by it that they couldn't help but document it. But how many other technologies went undocumented and were simply lost? Let me tell you about modern attempts to recreate functional Macuahuitls, because this is where experimental archaeology gets cool. There are researchers and craftspeople who've spent years trying to create authentic reproductions, and the results are mixed. Some have created weapons that look right and function okay, but they don't perform like Spanish accounts suggest the originals did. The problem is we're missing something. Maybe it's the exact obsidian type, maybe it's the adhesive formula, maybe it's some aspect of the blade orientation or the wood preparation that isn't obvious from looking at museum pieces, but the reproductions don't quite match what Spanish sources describe. One researcher, I think his name was Rick Hogstad, spent like 10 years working on this. He learned obsidian knapping from indigenous teachers in Mexico. He experimented with different woods, different adhesives, different blade shapes, and he created Macuahuitls that are impressive. But he admits they're probably not quite right. There's something we're missing. Some aspect of the traditional knowledge that's been lost. And that's frustrating because it suggests the Aztec craftsmen understood things about materials and engineering that we still don't fully grasp. Here's a thought experiment that I find fascinating. What if the Aztecs had had time to continue developing their technology without Spanish intervention? Where would obsidian weapons technology have gone? They were already experimenting with composite materials, combining obsidian with wood and adhesives. That's sophisticated materials engineering. Given another few centuries, could they have developed even more advanced composites, better adhesives, different blade configurations? We know that technologies tend to develop along optimization curves. Each generation makes incremental improvements. The Spanish conquest cut off that developmental process. We don't know what the endpoint would have been. Maybe obsidian technology had already peaked. Maybe the Macuahuitl was as good as it could get with the available materials. Or maybe the Aztecs were just getting started, and we lost centuries of potential innovation when the knowledge was suppressed. We'll never know. And that's a tragedy not just for historical knowledge, but for human technological development in general. Because different cultures developing different tech paths can lead to innovations that benefit everyone when the knowledge is shared rather than destroyed. Let me talk about the physics of cutting for a minute, because understanding this helps explain why obsidian is so effective. When you cut something, you're creating a new surface by breaking molecular bonds. The force required depends on how many bonds you're breaking simultaneously. A sharper blade breaks fewer bonds at once because it's creating a thinner cut. Each individual bond requires the same force to break, so breaking fewer bonds means less total force needed. This is why sharper is better for cutting. It's not about some mystical property of sharpness, it's just basic physics. Fewer bonds to break equals less force required. But there's a limit to how sharp you can make steel. The edge will deform or chip if you try to make it too thin, because steel, at microscopic scales, has a crystalline structure that creates weak points along crystal boundaries. Obsidian doesn't have that crystal structure, it's amorphous glass, so you can make it absurdly sharp, down to that molecular level edge, without running into structural limitations. The sharpness is limited only by the size of the molecules themselves. That's why obsidian can cut things steel can't. It's not magic. It's materials science and physics. The Aztecs figured this out empirically, through experimentation, without understanding the atomic level processes involved, but they knew what worked. And here's something I find really interesting. The Aztecs weren't the only culture to use obsidian weapons. Other Mesoamerican cultures did too. The Maya, the Teotihuacanos, various other groups. But the Aztecs seem to have pushed the technology the furthest. Why? Maybe because the Aztecs were a militaristic society that prioritized warfare and weapons development. Maybe because they had access to particularly good obsidian sources. Maybe because they had larger populations and more resources to devote to specialized craftsmanship. Or maybe they just got really, really good at one specific technology and kept optimizing it while other cultures diversified their tech development. It's like how Japanese swordsmiths developed katana making to an incredible level of sophistication. It's not that other cultures couldn't make swords. They could. But Japan developed a specific tradition that optimized one approach to extreme levels. The Aztecs did something similar with obsidian. Let me tell you about something that doesn't get talked about enough: the psychological effect of obsidian weapons. Because warfare isn't just about the physical capability of weapons, it's also about how those weapons affect enemy morale. Spanish soldiers were terrified of Macuahuitls. You can read it in their accounts. These weapons could do things their armor was supposed to protect against. That's psychologically devastating. Your defense, The thing you rely on to keep you alive suddenly isn't working. And the wounds from obsidian weapons were different from steel weapons. They were cleaner in some ways, less crushing damage, more slicing, but they were also often more severe. An obsidian blade could slice through things that a steel sword would catch on. The Spanish learned to fear Aztec warriors with Macuahuitls more than warriors with other weapons. That fear affected tactics, affected morale, affected decision-making in battle. The psychological impact of the obsidian weapons was almost as important as the physical impact. Now I want to address something that comes up in discussions of ancient weapons. Were obsidian weapons really better than steel, or is this just romanticizing indigenous technology? And the answer is, it depends on what you mean by better. For pure cutting power against unarmored or lightly armored opponents, obsidian was probably superior. For durability and versatility, steel wins. For long campaigns, steel. For short, intense battles, obsidian. What I think is important is to recognize that the Aztecs had developed a genuine high-level technology. This wasn't primitive. This wasn't making do with inferior materials. This was sophisticated material science that exploited properties of obsidian that European metalworkers weren't even aware of. The fact that steel eventually became dominant worldwide doesn't mean it was always better in every situation. It means it was better in enough situations and durable enough, and produced in societies that happened to become globally dominant. History is written by the winners, and the winners had steel. So we've inherited a narrative where steel equals advanced and obsidian equals primitive. But that's not accurate. They were different technologies with different advantages. Let me tell you about one more thing that blew my mind while researching this. The Aztecs were doing quality control on obsidian blades. They had standards. Archaeological analysis of obsidian workshops shows that craftsmen were rejecting blades that didn't meet specifications. They had standards for blade thickness, for edge sharpness, for symmetry. Blades that didn't meet standards were discarded or recycled. That's industrial quality control. In a pre-industrial society, they understood that standardization and quality control were necessary for effective weapons production. Some workshops seem to have specialized in different stages of production. Some focused on rough napping, creating blade blanks. Others focused on fine finishing, bringing blades to final edge sharpness. Others focused on hafting, attaching blades to wooden cores. That's division of labor and specialization. That's manufacturing efficiency. The Aztecs had basically developed an arms industry with production standards, specialized roles, and quality control systems. This is way more sophisticated than most people realize. When we talk about ancient civilizations, there's this tendency to assume everything was artisanal, one-off, individual craftsmen doing everything by hand with no systematization. But the Aztecs had systematized obsidian weapons production to an impressive degree. So where does all this leave us? What's the takeaway from the story of obsidian weapons? For me, it's about challenging our assumptions about technological development. We tend to think of technology as this linear progression: stone tools, then bronze, then iron, then steel, each clearly better than the last. But that's not how it actually worked. The Aztecs developed stone tool technology to a level that was competitive with or superior to European metal technology in specific applications. They didn't progress to metal, not because they couldn't, but because they'd already optimized their available materials so effectively that there wasn't pressure to switch. And this matters because it changes how we think about other primitive technologies. Maybe there are other examples of ancient societies developing technologies that we've underestimated or misunderstood. Maybe there are techniques and knowledge that were lost when those societies were conquered or collapsed. The obsidian Macuahuitl is a reminder that technological sophistication can take many forms. It doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a wooden club with glass blades, But those glass blades can slice through steel armor because the people who made them understood properties of materials that wouldn't be formally studied for centuries. And here's my final thought on this. We should be studying these ancient technologies more seriously, not just as historical curiosities, but as potentially valuable knowledge. Modern materials science is discovering that some ancient techniques produced results we can't fully replicate with modern methods. Roman concrete that's stronger than modern concrete, Damascus steel with properties we still don't understand, and obsidian weapons that are sharper than modern surgical scalpels. What if there's knowledge embedded in these ancient technologies that could benefit us today? What if the Aztec understanding of obsidian could teach us something about cutting tools, about composite materials, about working with brittle substances? We've been so focused on looking forward, on developing new technologies, that we've maybe neglected looking backward to see what we can learn from cultures that develop solutions to problems we're still struggling with. The obsidian Macuahuitl, a weapon that terrorized Spanish conquistadors, that challenged our assumptions about materials and warfare, that represented a technological peak for a civilization that no longer exists. It's more than just a historical artifact. It's a reminder that human ingenuity takes many forms, that sophistication doesn't always look like what we expect, and that sometimes the sharpest cutting edge comes not from steel forged in fire, but from volcanic glass shaped by patient hands and deep understanding. That's the real story of obsidian weapons, not just that they could cut through steel armor, though they could, but that they represent a different way of thinking about technology, a different approach to solving problems, a different path through the landscape of human innovation, a path that was cut short by conquest and colonization, but that still has things to teach us if we're willing to listen.